We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. I'd like to welcome to the program John Barry. He's a professor at Tulane University, the School of Public Health, the author of The Great Influenza, which was written with 2004, I believe, and is now a bestseller for obvious reasons. John Barry, welcome to the program.
Thanks. Yeah, for unfortunate reasons.
Indeed.
So it was a bestseller when it came out.
All right.
So,
well, that's and there were other people who may have had at least a little bit of foreshadowing, I guess. And let's start there because you in 2000, I know it was in the aughts, you were appointed to a commission that George W. Bush set up to deal with pandemics. Just give me a sense of like the work you did on that commission, and what is of that work, what remains of that work today, I guess.
Okay. Well, the Bush administration and he personally was the prime mover. Got very involved in pandemic preparedness. They passed a $7 billion bill. It created the national stockpile, invested a lot of money in vaccine research and technology, did all sorts of other things. And part of that was trying to figure out what so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions would be. In other words, what do you do when you don't have any drugs? What kind of public health practices made sense that might mitigate a pandemic? So that process was what I was involved in personally. And the federal plan, and in fact, all 50 states, they each have a plan. All of them start out with the number one step in this. I kept beating on this based on what happened in 1918, was that you tell the truth, that total transparency is the number one requirement to get the public to adhere to public health recommendations. So the second lesson from studying 1918 is that social distancing and other measures like that work, which we know not only from our impact here, but from other countries around the world. So the transparency we've obviously had a problem with, and largely because of it, I think there's been reluctance by too many people to adhere to the social distancing and hand washing and mask recommendations. And that is hurting our ability to fight the pandemic. And then, of course, national stockpile problems, testing failure, the PPE issue, all those things are problems as well, not yet resolved, unfortunately.
So, I'm glad you gave the two big lessons because I've been following what you've been writing over the past couple of months and some of the interviews you've done, and obviously reading some from your book. And I was going to ask you, and I want to actually go through, why that's a lesson that we learned in 1918 in terms of transparency and in terms of social distancing. But let's just start with: is there a third lesson as well? I wanted to go just two deeper than most of the other times I've heard you talk about this. Is there a third one in terms of what maybe? If there is one, what would that be?
No, I think those two cover it.
Okay.
Again, the public health advice is crucial to saving lives in a pandemic, and you're not going to get adherence to it unless you tell the truth. I think that's been demonstrated around the world. In China, of course, so to qualify that, obviously you have a boot that of an authoritarian government that can shut things down. But we're in a free society, so.
let's talk about why, what it was about 1918's pandemic that it became so clear, the need for transparency. One of the things I think prior to this event that I was aware of the 1918 pandemic was just how little it seemed to remain in the consciousness of the country. And I don't know if that's a function of the way that it was treated at the time, or if it was just because it was overshadowed by World War II. But what are the what were the mistakes made in 1918 around transparency that show us how important it is today?
Well, for very different reasons from today. The government lied, and in 1918 there was fake news, but it was fake because newspapers were knowingly printing what the government was telling them, and knowing that these things were not true. They were printing them anyway. But again, for different reasons. We were at war, and the government had created something called the Committee for Public Information, a propaganda arm. The architect of the committee said, truth and falsehood are arbitrary terms. Nothing in experience tells us one is preferable to the other. All that matters is their inspirational value. Then, in addition, they had a law that punishable by 20 years in jail to utter, write, print, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the government of the United States. And they enforced that law. So between the desire to inspire people to be patriotic and help with the war effort, and the fear, the stick of prosecuting you if you said anything that was negative, truth wasn't even a defense. The newspapers went along with self-censorship, and when the government said things like, "This is ordinary influenza by another name," it was referred to as Spanish influenza, although it didn't start in Spain. And newspapers published that, and people knew they were being lied to. It's not, there are now some people honestly think this whole thing is overblown. Nobody thought it was overblown in 1918. Well, number one, nobody was hyping it, but more importantly, people could die in less than 24 hours. The virus was much more lethal than what we're facing today. Well, thank God, because what we're facing today is bad enough. Some of the symptoms were horrific, and not at all like ordinary influenza. But in Little Rock, for example, a few miles outside Little Rock, you got an army camp where doctors are writing thousands of cots, lining the barracks, being transformed. Here, there is nothing but death and destruction. And just a few miles away, the Little Rock newspaper is writing things like Spanish influenza, same old chills and fever. Nothing to it. And in Philadelphia, when they are digging mass graves and finally close schools and churches and so forth and so on, one of the newspapers actually says, "This is not a public health measure. You have no reason for fear or panic. You have no reason for alarm." So people know these are lies, and the result was counterproductive. Instead of reassuring people, they got, with a deadly threat, knowing they're being lied to, you create panic. Since they know they can't believe anything they're being told, all that does is spread rumor and alienation. Everybody for himself or herself, their own families. The result is you actually have reports of people starving to death because nobody had the courage to bring them food when they were too sick to take care of themselves. And that happened in big cities and in rural communities.
And we should say the irony of I guess the reporting on it was that it got the name Spanish flu simply because Spain was the first country to acknowledge that it existed.
Essentially, because they were not at war, and the European nations all had a censored press. In the U.S., it was self-censored, but self-censorship was by and large very effective.
Okay, so let's and what was there? I mean, I guess I don't want to get to this too early, but I guess we're sort of here. Like this notion that we can't trust the government because they're saying, and we can't trust the newspapers as institutions because they're saying this is no big deal. Yet I know that down the road there's dozens of people with literally like the symptoms could be like blood pouring out of like your nose, right, or your mouth.
That's correct. In some army camps where we have good data, 15% of troops actually had nosebleed, and a much fewer number, but much scarier. People could bleed from their mouth as well, and even their eyes and ears. And you imagine that happening to lay people in a civilian population. That is frightening. Not exactly reassuring if you're a healthcare professional either.
So will you just walk us through the multiple waves, because there was, and I know that there was particularly around the time that you printed this, there was some controversy over the question of how the virus mutated and whether the first wave and the second wave were the same, I guess, version of this flu.
Well, you're correct. There are a minority of virologists who are not quite willing to concede. The first wave was quite mild, and it was also spotty. By no means was every place hit. In fact, a minority of places were hit. Western Europe was pretty hard hit by it, but in the rest of the world, including the United States, it was hit or miss. And it was also very mild. So mild, there were medical journal articles suggesting that it looked and smelled like influenza, but not enough people were dying, so it probably wasn't influenza. Then the second wave turned really lethal. And because of those differences in virulence, a few virologists are not willing to accept. They don't dispute it exactly. They're just not sure yet that it was the same virus. I think the evidence is overwhelming that the virus is the same. I could go into great detail, but that would be a waste of your time. Let me just say that we now have a virus that has been sequenced from as early as May 1918, which is the same virus as the ones that's been circulated in the fall. In addition, if you got sick in the first wave, you had pretty high immunity, as high as 89% against effectiveness against getting sick in the second wave. And you compare that to a modern influenza vaccine, in the last 20 years has ranged from 10% effectiveness to 62%. So when the immunity you're getting from exposure to the first wave is significantly better than the best modern vaccine, and when the two virus samples, when that as early as May is the same as the fall virus, and there are other reasons as to why I think it's the same virus, and I think most virologists think it's the same virus. I am not a virologist.
Right.
Let me make that clear.
Well, so why was the second wave so much more devastating than the first?
Well, the virus changed. We're not quite sure how. And, it's could be some other differences, could be environmental factors. I don't think so. Could be the bacterial environment, since a lot of deaths were from bacterial pneumonia, secondary invaders. I really think it's just a mutation of the virus. It was also much more widespread. I think the virus just got better at infecting people.
I mean, I guess from a total layperson's perspective, another big lesson of this is that like it's highly there's some basic things that you can predict, but then after that, it's just sort of like you just don't know.
Well, that's true. Particularly with influenza is one of the fastest mutating viruses in existence. So, that's what it does. That's why you need a different vaccine every year. I should say that even in the spring, when it was generally mild, there were pockets of virulence that gave strong hints that it could be very lethal. I am not in the slightest worried that COVID-19 is going to turn more virulent. There isn't any evidence in any, it does mutate, but much more slowly than influenza. Seems a lot more stable. There's no hint anywhere that the virus is going to become more virulent. So if your listeners are worried about the second wave of COVID-19, I wouldn't worry about that.
You wouldn't worry about it insofar as it being particularly more lethal than it is now, which is still, we should say, obviously 100,000 people more in, effectively 2.5 months or so of it being in the country, particularly when we were all, many of us staying at home, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
That's pretty lethal. It's just that you don't anticipate it turning into something even more lethal.
Correct. It is bad enough as it is. And, as you just said, when a lot of us were staying at home, at the time that most of the country went into lockdown, if you look at the numbers, and it's a pretty simple mathematical equation, there would be over 500,000 deaths by now if we hadn't done that, I think. And the worst case projections for that virus were 2 million deaths. And I think we would have been fast on our way to the worst case and maybe even exceeding the worst case if we had not intervened. We actually stopped the first wave. It's still spreading in the United States. We were a long way from where Germany is, not to mention South Korea. But we have many countries have done much better in terms of turning the curve downward than we have. But we made a lot of progress. Hopefully coming out of lockdown, people will social distance and wash their hands and put masks on and keep it from exploding again. It's still a threat.
I want to return to sort of like, where we go from here and make an assessment of how we done. But I also want to talk about something that I found really interesting. And this actually came up in an interview that I did last week on Keynes, who traveled as part of, I guess, a contingency of folks traveled to Versailles for the peace process following World War I.
Right.
And
right.
And so and this came up in that conversation about Wilson, who never is, as far as I understand it, mentioned the Spanish flu epidemic or pandemic, I guess, in the United States or anywhere, never mentioned it publicly ever. Yet came down with it. And tell us this story, because the implications of what happened with Wilson catching this seem to have reverberated over the course of the next, till today, I would imagine.
Well, that virus in 1918 could infect almost any organ. In fact, we're finding COVID-19 as it's not just a respiratory virus. That's pretty clear. And all the scientific reviews after the pandemic in 1918 concluded, as one of them said, second only to pulmonary problems was mental disorders. That's practically a direct quote. People seem to become schizophrenic. The people Oliver Sacks wrote about in The Awakening, it's hypothesized that they had gotten influenza, and that's why they became almost comatose. There was a disease in the 1920s that surfaced called encephalitis lethargica, kind of self-explanatory, which disappeared. That was considered the last sequel to influenza. And it's very common for people to be totally disoriented, their mind's not functioning. So Wilson gets very seriously ill with influenza in Paris in the middle of the peace conference. And prior to getting ill, he had been adamant and insisting upon the principles that he had brought the United States into the war over, which basically, that was a war to, quote, make the world safe for democracy, unquote. And he wanted peace without victory.
In other words,
And
by peace without victory, peace without triumphalism, and a list of, he had 14 principles that
right,
were
exactly.
consistent with the idea of like, we're not looking to punish anybody here.
Exactly. And he gets sick. He becomes disoriented. Everybody who dealt with him commented on this, ranging from Irving Hoover, the White House usher, to Herbert Hoover, who was who of course went on to be president. And Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister. Everybody commented how his mind wasn't functioning very well, and he went back to negotiations with the French Prime Minister, Clemenceau, whose nickname was the Tiger. And all of a sudden, he caved in on everything except Clemenceau threw him the bone of the League of Nations. So Germany was punished. The French took control of some German lands. There were reparations. There were all sorts of things. Wilson himself said if he was a German, he wasn't sure he would sign the peace treaty. And of course, pretty much every historian says that peace treaty certainly contributed to the rise of the Nazis and the outbreak of World War II.
I mean, it is stunning that something that had such impact across the globe, right? Killing millions of people. We don't even really know how many specifically died of the Spanish flu. But it's at least tens of millions, right? And that it impacting one individual could have such reverberations for the rest of at least history as we've lived it at this point is, I think, just it's a little mind-blowing.
Yeah, I agree with you. And that look, as we know, individuals matter. Personalities matter. You can look at the White House today. We're in a very different place than we would have been if Hillary Clinton had been elected. So many things would be different. So, people think elections don't matter, whether you're, and they do.
Was there a similar dynamic in 1918 to what we've seen today, where people living in low income or poverty, or people who are Hispanic or African Americans who are between those three different cohorts are suffering the majority of the impact, at least this point, in terms of like the medically, like, is there a similar dynamic from 1918, or is our society structured in such a disparate, a more disparate way now that is more dramatic?
Well, there were plenty of epidemiological studies that looked at how many, the amount of space that someone had in their home, which of course is a function of socioeconomic, which is of course a function of race, often, not entirely. And it's pretty well established that the more square footage you had in your home per person, the better off you were. I mean, that makes logical. You would guess that would be the case, and in fact, it was the case. So, as I said, that probably correlates to racial disparities. In terms of studies that actually look directly at race, other than how many people are living in the same house, there's actually a little bit of a mixed bag on that. Some studies did find racial disparities, but there were others that did not.
I want to just touch on too what you had just mentioned earlier, that COVID-19 is not just a respiratory infection. mean, do we have a broader sense of the different? I mean, I know that it can have implications for kidneys. We've seen some variation. What is the what we're seeing with children with the sort of like, I guess, semi Kawasaki disease? I mean, do we have a sense of this? Like, how much? How? Like, let me maybe phrase it this way as you answer that question. How much more do we know today than we did, say, in March about this?
Well, we know a lot more today than in March, but we still don't know as much. We're learning what the questions are to ask. We haven't gotten the answers, would be what I think the situation is. All sorts of, and plus a lot of these things that we're seeing in Europe and in the United States now, they either didn't occur in China or they weren't reported in China. And, whatever criticism people have of the government of China in terms of their scientific sharing of data from, their own reviews in published articles in their own scientific journals, and the sharing of the genome, which was quite early, I think January 11th. On the pure science side, they were slow to accept CDC and WHO representatives into the country to look for themselves, but the publications were out there and have been out there, and a lot of these things were not reported in China, and they have good scientists and observers there. So it's not really clear what was going on there, whether it's different, whether the genetic differences, environmental differences, cultural differences, things like that. A lot of questions, not that many answers yet.
So, in other words, we could have specific, as a population, we could have specific medical ailments, or we could have specific environmental factors that are causing the disease to act differently in enough of a people where we pay attention to it, as opposed to maybe in China, for instance.
Conceivably, yeah. I don't want to go overboard on that. The larger differences, if there are any, there may be genetic. But again, we don't know, and I'm more of an historian than, I don't want to oversell myself as a scientist or virologist and so forth. I read these reports. It takes me most of the day just to catch up to my emails, and a lot of that time is spent reading clinical reports and scientific reports. But I'm not a scientist.
All right, well, fair enough. And so, lastly, I mean, in terms of like where, because I know you did a lot of interviews in the early days of the lockdown. Like where if we were doing what we're doing now, when you were in March, how concerned would you be then, and how concerned are you now? In other words, like, has your understanding of like transmission and the way things have handled, has that also evolved, and has that changed your outlook as to where we are today?
Well, it's evolved a little bit. I don't know if it's changed my outlook. It seems that being outside is safer than it looked initially, perhaps. And CDC concluded that what they call fomites, doorknobs and things like that, are less important than they initially thought in transmission. It seems that face-to-face, things like conversation, is more important. We always knew something like that was important, but seems to be even more important. There seems to be more cluster-oriented spread than, so you have super spreading events more than a smoother, flatter, average. So there are differences in terms of not in terms of physically how the virus transmits, but the kind of situations in which the virus is more likely to transmit. In terms of where we are now, I think you try to apply that understanding, which would mean things like church service is probably maybe even more threatening than we might have thought earlier. But in terms of lockdown and so forth, I do think probably most places came out prematurely. By the same token, there are some places where the virus seems to have petered out. We don't fully understand in Japan, for example, why Japan is done relatively well. And I think public health measures can Japan was not as aggressive as other places in terms of they closed schools and so forth, but it wasn't the kind of lockdown some other places had, and they were not really great on testing, and they weren't, they were so concerned with the Olympics going forward that they were really kind of slow moving initially, yet they didn't have the explosive spread that we had in the United States. That could be accounted for by cultural differences.
Right.
And probably is certainly a factor. Well, again, I do think. Go ahead, ask a question.
Well, okay. So, so, give me a sense of what you think will happen. I mean, my understanding is that most experts now feel like this is something that we're going to have, barring a vaccination, which is, I think people had more aspirational perspectives on this than sort of real ones, that we're not going to have a vaccine for some time. And by time, right. I mean, at least, we're measuring this probably in years, less than months, or certainly weeks, that this is going to be sort of an ongoing situation. And we may have to have like some spotty lockdowns in certain areas, but we're going to go forward until we get essentially to some type of like herd immunity over the course of the next, I don't know, year and a half.
I'd probably go along with that. The herd immunity idea, Sweden has been trying that, and so far they haven't been very successful. On a per capita basis, they have more deaths than we do. It's a small country, only 10 million population. And yet they've only got less than 10% of the, not only on a per capita basis, but if you adjust for population, just simple math, they have more deaths, considerably more deaths than we have so far. And they have less than 10% of the population has been exposed to the virus. So they're what looked like a pretty interesting effort on herd immunity. It's not going so well right now. And, how long you remain immune to the virus once you get it, most people think that'll be at least a year. Hopefully that's correct. The vaccine is the answer. Therapeutic drugs, if we get some really effective ones, as I'm sure you're aware, they could hopefully come online sooner than the vaccine.
Right, and that the idea is to mitigate the implications of getting it. And we should just say that there's no analog to in the pandemic of 1918. I know that it was that people in the ages, I think it was, if I remember correctly, mid-20s to mid-30s were the sort of primary. The death rate was the highest amongst that cohort of people, and that was a function of, at least the speculation is that older people had probably been exposed to a flu that was like similar in some way that ended up giving them more protection? Is
Right.
that what it was? We don't have anything like that for coronavirus, do we? Or is it just like this is a
No.
straight? Okay, this is more just a straight. It really is devastating for people, broadly speaking. Obviously, many exceptions, but for people who just have compromised immunity.
Correct. Nobody. Influenza has circulated, other influenza viruses, for a long time, hundreds of years, in 1918. And apparently, over 90% of the excess mortality back then was people under 65. Now, normally, influenza kills the elderly and kids. As you pointed out, in 1918, that was by no means the case. The elderly essentially escaped. Children died in very large numbers, very large. But the peak age for death was 28. And probably 2/3 of the dead were between 18 and 45. And of course, right now we're facing a very different profile. But nobody has immunity to this coronavirus. Nobody in the world. It's never circulated before. So you have 100% of the population is potentially susceptible to it. And 1918, and really for any influenza virus, that's probably not quite the same. You probably get some cross protection from having seen other influenza viruses, but nobody has that protection from coronavirus.
Okay, and lastly, and I appreciate you're giving us all this time because I know that your inbox is filling up here. But is there any analog? And I don't want to obviously what has taken place over the past couple of days is a function of a problem that we have in our society that obviously, frankly, predated the 1918 pandemic. But certainly the lockdown and the impact of this pandemic on the Black community has added to sort of like, I don't know, the Tinder, if you will, for what has taken place over the past couple of days. Is there an analog from 1918? Or do you, go ahead.
Not really. I agree with what you're saying about currently. Obviously, when you're locked down and lose your job, according to the numbers, 40% of the people making under $40,000 a year lost their jobs. So I remember the 40%. I might be slightly wrong on the dollar figure. So, you're under tremendous economic stress. Then you find out, if you're African American, that your race is more subject to death. On top of everything else, you got a lot of reason to be upset. And this, created a tinderbox, as you said. But there was nothing like that in 1918. You could get into other things that occurred about the same time that led to an outbreaks of violence in 1919. But they were not simply racial. You had Black soldiers coming back from the war who'd been treated fairly in Europe and who wanted some rights, and you get race riots in 15 or 20 cities. You get in, sort of a slaughter in a place called Wayne, Arkansas, where possibly, quite a few African Americans were killed. Then you have anarchists sending bombs to the Attorney General of the United States. You have police strike in Boston, which got Calvin Coolidge the presidency. You've got a general strike in Seattle, but those all came in 1919. There was the war, it was a boiling pot, and the top, it was a pressure cooker, and the top was on during the war, and the war ended, and you took the top off, and everything sort of exploded in 1919. In fact, my original plan was to write a book about 1919, not to write a book about the pandemic. But I ended up diverting the that plan didn't work.
Well,
And obviously ended up writing a book on the pandemic,
well,
exclusively on the pandemic.
well, frankly, I'm glad you did. John Barry, the book is The Great Influenza. We'll put a link to it. I imagine a lot of people hopefully have already are aware of it. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome, and thank you.